um, let's dive in tonight and let's talk about a quick review of what we talked about last week. So this is going to be summary for last week's stuff, but as you're looking at it, this is the stuff that's basically encompassed in your PowerPoint slides for last week. So we talked about the Sabbath, the seventh day of creation, happening on Genesis 2, 1 through 3. And this is where the temple picture that is Genesis 1, 1, 2, 3 comes to a close. The seventh and final day of creation brings the temple picture to a close. Now, the seventh day that we call the Sabbath has absolutely nothing to do with physical rest. God is not a physical being. He has no need to take breaks and restore lost energy. That much should be obvious, but sometimes with good Bible study and good teachings, not only do you have to restate the obvious, it's just the best place to start. Now, I put in parentheses here, it does not directly have anything to do with it, because tonight we're actually going to talk about what is the concept of rest that we are to engage in, that God does not have to engage in. So, if it's not about physical rest, what is it about? Well, it's all in keeping with the mindset that I've been teaching since February, that the physical material has nothing to do with what Genesis 1 is actually about as a creation story. The author is and has stayed focused on creation of function and purpose within an orderly system. He's not creating material. The material's already there. He's more or less arranging the material, turning the chaotic waters below into an organized universe. This is the limited human picture at play here. And in keeping with all the regular ancient Near Eastern creation stories, God, upon the completion of building his temple, rests within it. We read last week, and they're in your slides, the Enuma Elish and the Baal cycle, how when these gods triumph, they order the cosmos, and then they have a temple built. And in Marduk's case, in the Enuma Elish, he has all of Babylon built, with Isagila being the specific temple that he has built. But all gods, when they're done creating in ancient Near Eastern creation stories, they build their temple and they rest. So this is telling us that the Genesis creation story in Genesis 1 is not a creation story out of step with ancient Near Eastern authors. And so you would expect the last thing the God to do when he finishes building his temple is that he rests inside that temple. Lo and behold, the key to reading Genesis 1 properly is actually in Genesis 2, the first 3 verses. The fact that God rests tells us that these 6 days preceding the seventh are creation temple stories. Creation is to be viewed as a temple. This is what the author is getting at. This is how he's forming a story. And probably the main text to look at is in the Baal cycle, the fact that Baal's temple is built over 7 days, and then he rests in that temple. So the author is taking a very known Phoenician creation story about Baal's victory over the forces of chaos, that is the sea dragon Yam, and creating and ordering the cosmos, and then building a temple, and then resting in the temple. And then he's applying all of that to Yahweh. Did they have different reasons for taking that rest? According to what I'm talking about here, no. Because they both mean that the God, in this case Yahweh, is installed within the temple, and he becomes the head of the created order. Except here, the difference is that, a guy like Baal, or a god like Baal, and a god like Marduk, they're installed within their temple. But God is being installed in creation, all creation. Creation is the temple. This is the picture that we're supposed to understand and get. And God is filling all of creation. But the temple idea, the notion of the temple that we talked about, was that like the president residing in the White House. It's his command center. It's the place from which His will and His orders go forth. And so God now resides within all of creation as the place from which His rule as king will go forth. That's the story of Genesis 1. And that's very, very different from what most people assume Genesis 1 is about, because they assume it has to be about physical matter being created. This is about purpose. This is about the rule of God being set up and established. The same way Enuma Elish is about Marduk's rule. The same way that the Baal cycle is about the victorious Baal setting up his rule. So okay, now on to this. When the author is communicating that God Sabbaths, and it is the Hebrew word for Sabbath here in Genesis 2, ceasing would be a better way to translate that, because what God is doing on the seventh day is He's ceasing from His creative works and He's moving on to the normal functioning operations. It's like a guy who's building a computer. He's assembled it and then he turns it on. Now the guy is going to actually set up the computer so that it would run its normal functions. The 6 days of creation preceding the seventh day are about God setting it all up, and then the seventh day, God ceases setting it up, and then He, having set it up, runs it thereafter. The normal operating functions and purposes that God set up are now to go on continuing with God at the controls. This is the idea of Genesis 1 through 3. And it's not the idea that you're ever going to hear preached in a sermon. It's not the idea that you're ever going to hear taught in a church. It's barely the idea you're going to hear taught at Bible colleges and seminaries, because it's just so utterly foreign to us. But that was the everyday thinking of the ancients. A child in the ancient world would have understood what the Sabbath was about. We go through our whole lives and we don't understand what God was doing. And so we miss the whole context that God was setting up a temple called creation. And it's a very different picture. So all of that is what is being communicated by the ancient author when he says that God rests. He takes up residence within the temple creation. God, his invisible manifestations and power are clearly visible and seen from creation. This is what Paul says in Romans 1. But he's reflecting back on the idea of what God did on the seventh day. He didn't just get tired and sit down on His throne like I've been doing all week because I'm tired. No, God takes the controls and he says, now it's time to rule. He ceases the setup operations and goes into control mode. And then the last part of this review is that, yes, day 6 was a creative climax. Creations, being the human image bearers, are the highest creation created. But day 7 is the true theological climax of the story. It's the day that says God actually sat down to rule creation on the seventh day. It doesn't end with humanity. It keeps going until God is enthroned above humanity. And as the Bible Project video that we watched and stuff have pointed out, there is no end to the seventh day in the story. And this is a part of what is going on here. So John Walton, and I think this will be the last Walton quote that I give you, says, sometimes people have raised the question, what did God do on the 8th day? In the view being presented here, on the 8th day and on every day since then, He is in the control room from where He runs the cosmos that He set up. This is the ongoing work of creation. When we thought of Genesis 1 as an account of material origins, creation became an action in the past that is over and done with. God made objects and now the cosmos exists materially. Viewing Genesis 1 as an account of functional origins offers more opportunity for understanding that God's creative work continues. God is still Sabbathing in the sense that He is not creating new things. He is in the control room making sure the order of the 3 realms that He set up and all the creative functionaries that He set up are functioning properly. If you read the book of Job, he's constantly saying to Job, trying to get Job to let go of his control over the situation. And he says, do you feed the birds on the heights of the mountains? Do you go out into the desert and feed the jackals and stuff, and he just jumps all over creation, and he basically says, do you take care of them? Do you understand just how big and expansive creation actually is beyond you? And do you take care of all of it? Because I do, Job. So can you trust me with your situation and what you're going on, what's going on with you, or do you need the answers? Because if you need the answers, your trust in me is somewhat limited. And I want your trust in me to go beyond that. So God is, in the end, in the control room, so to speak, at the White House, ruling and controlling everything and guiding it towards its functional purpose. Now, this brings us to the actual commandment and the aspect of the gift of rest. Now, this is the fourth commandment, and it says this: remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the seventh day, that is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living amongst you. Basically, that summarizes the fact that anybody, you, sons and daughters, male and female slaves, livestock, foreigners living among you, anybody in the ancient Israelite society, this applies to. And he's just trying to speak as exhaustively as he can to include all categories of people there. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the seventh day and set it apart as holy. So he opens with the statement of saying the Sabbath is holy, and he closes with the statement of saying the Sabbath is holy. And what you are to do is crammed in between these. Now, I would potentially argue that verse 8 and this last sentence down here in verse 11, that like Genesis 2, that word Sabbath, Shabbat, should probably be translated into our English as ceasing the same way. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Not verses 8 and 11. On that day, okay, down here in verse 11, this is where I got confused. That this word for rested, sorry, not this word for this word for rested, I think they're the same word in Hebrew, I don't remember, that on the seventh day he ceased would probably be a more accurate way to translate that, because it's translating the idea. You have a day of rest because God ceased to actually create and took up the controls of the universe. So here's the idea. Where does the gift of rest for creation come from? What is the theological connecting point between these ideas? God ceases his work on that day when we're supposed to rest today. How did the ancients understand this, and where did they go wrong, or where do we go wrong? What is the point of God creating a day of rest for his physical creations? Once every creation cycle of 7 days, we can conclude the week by resting from our work to express trust in God as the real ruler over the creation. If you believe that God is actually in the control room, in control of all creation, that he's the real ruler and king of this world, take a break. Let yourself rest, because you're acting out the proof that you are not really in control of your life. Your trust in God is strong enough to say, for 6 days I've been working on this issue. It's not going to kill me. The universe is not going to implode if I take 24 hours to just let God do something with this that's out of my control, and then on Monday or Sunday morning, I'll come back to this and try some more. You are expressing genuine trust in God by not doing something at the prescribed time, knowing that He still is in control and still doing something. And if you can express that faith, you are keeping the Sabbath holy. Yeah, if you don't, you're like Job. And you're just like the other guys. Now, Job was not particularly about the Sabbath. The Sabbath was not Job's problem, but his faith was being expressed the same way. So in terms of expressing faith, yes, exactly like Job. Now, Isaiah puts it this way. Isaiah 58 is this chapter where he's constantly talking about basically Jewish religious rites, fasting, I think giving to the poor is in there, but he concludes the chapter right here about the Sabbath. He's basically telling the people, stop fasting and not following me. Stop giving your money to the poor when you don't actually love me and all this stuff. And then he says this about the Sabbath. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it not by going your own way and doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So the idea here that Isaiah is tapping into in two short little verses is to say, the Sabbath was not a day for you to just go off and do whatever you want. The Sabbath is a day for you to express trust in the Lord. I think when he's probably talking about going your own way here in the Sabbath, Isaiah is implying doing work in the sense of trying to control things, trying to make a profit, trying to run your own life aside from needing God. And what Isaiah is trying to tell the people to do is, hey, stop fasting, stop giving to the poor, stop doing all of the religious acts, and stop violating the Sabbath in the sense that stop trying to rule your own life. Stop trying to make decisions that I've told you already what decisions I want. Let me be king over you, Israel, and stop using my Sabbath day for you to decide what's going to be right and what's going to be wrong. Use the Sabbath day for what I made it for. Take your hands off the controls, let it go, and relax. Let me say it like this. We cease working to exercise our trust that He did, in fact, sit down to rule the world. It acknowledges God's rule beyond our efforts. If you cannot let go of controlling a situation or a circumstance for just 24 hours and relax, you have no trust in God. You are only trusting your own power. You don't really believe that He is the Lord of the Sabbath, that He's in the control rooms and in control of your life and all creation, therefore your life within this creation, if you constantly feel like you have to be the one in control. The Sabbath is a weekly rhythm built into creation to say, express real trust in God by not trying to control things for 24 hours. Just relax. Let it go. Have some fun. Don't worry about your problems for 24 hours. Let them go. Now, is there any questions on that much? Do you see the relations between what God did on the seventh day, taking the controls, and what God wants us to do on the seventh day? Rest. Basically, it's like one giant Hebrew pun. God rest, therefore you rest. But God's rest doesn't mean He relaxed. It means He ceased creating, which is why I would probably translate it that way. Therefore, because He ceased creating and took up the controls, you rest, you relax. You're not in control. Here's 24 hours for you to express that. I know God said on day 6, go rule the world. I want you to rule the world. Day 7 is the counterbalance to that says, but you're not really in the ultimate control of the world, so don't try to rule too hard. Relax. That's the counterbalance to day 6. Yes, you have authority given to you by God, No, you are not God. He is still in a higher position of authority than you. This is your way of expressing that. 6 days of exercising authority, on the seventh day, you don't. There's a relationship between God's seventh day Sabbath and the commandment here, obviously, but it doesn't rest on the fact, there's a pun for you, it doesn't rest on the fact that God rested. And different words translated in our Bibles would help pull this out, but it does get lost in translation. Now, here's another question that I want to ask tonight, and I want to hear your genuine opinions on this. Is the Sabbath meant to be a day of worship? It feels like a trick question. Why? Am I that tricky? Yes. No? What's that? Isn't every day? Oh, that's a cop-out answer. It's like uh, it's like what Jared said Sunday in Sunday school. I just thought Jesus was always the answer. So the tricky thing about this answer is, that it can be a day of worship, but nothing in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, actually demands that it be a day for communal worship. So maybe I should have put communal worship up here on the title of this one. Is the Sabbath meant to be a day for communal worship? The answer is yeah, but it doesn't have to be. Nothing in the commandment that we looked at in Exodus 20 or in any of the subsequent books of Moses ever say that you have to worship on the Sabbath, that you stop working and go to a worship service. There's no connection there. So, under the Old Testament law, you are required not to work, but that doesn't mean that you're required to gather and worship. Historically, this comes from misreading Leviticus 23:3, which some translations call a holy convocation. And then they take this day to mean this verse right here talking about the Sabbath. It does not mean a day of holy worship. And some later Catholic translations in particular thought that convocation related to communal worship, public gatherings of worship. And so they turned this into a day of worship in their thinking, and they imposed it back on Old Testament thought. You could worship at the tabernacle, at the temple, on the Sabbath, and that means that the priest worked on the Sabbath. It was never a requirement under the law. The Sabbath did not become an official weekly day of worship for the Jewish community until sometime after the exile, when the synagogue worship gatherings on the Sabbath were instituted for the survival of their people, who are mostly scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. Under the pagan control of Persia, they're allowed to keep the Sabbath, which means the Sabbath is the only day the Persian Emperor Artaxerxes, the Sabbath is the only day they're agreeing with the Jews that they don't have to work. And most of those Jews are not in Palestine. They're scattered all throughout the empire. So it would develop over time into a required day of Jewish worship. You were a Jewish adult man, you were basically required to go to synagogue if there was one in your local village, or you went visiting a village that had one. It's less because those pagan kingdoms are oppressing you, although they were doing that. It was more that the synagogue develops because they're trying to keep their Jewish identities in pagan-controlled lands outside of Palestine. The synagogue system is what develops to help them do that. What does it mean to be Jewish outside of the Holy Land, to be God's people outside of the Holy Land, away from the tabernacle? The temple had been rebuilt. The synagogue was their answer to that. And everything that went on in the synagogue was to help reinforce what it meant to be Jewish, even if you're living under pagan domination. Exactly, and why everybody else wasn't. And so they conflate, if that's the right word, they take the Sabbath that they have available and they turn it into a day of worship. It's not wrong to do, but it was not what Moses was requiring of them. It was more a set of circumstances that they were having to work out. One of the few man rules that was more acceptable, I would say probably, depending on, because you can get really detailed about these man rules. The thing is, God has no problem with us making judgment calls and decisions for ourselves to help work things out. This is actually part of what it means to rule and subdue creation in Genesis 1:26. Yes. So you have to make certain government calls and decisions. I would argue that the church deciding to worship on Sundays is doing the same thing as the Jews deciding to turn the Sabbath into an official day of worship. But they're doing it differently as they break away from the Jewish communities. Because this is actually what you see Paul doing in the book of Acts when he goes to a new city and he goes to worship in a synagogue on a Saturday, on the Sabbath. And the New Testament is very clear. This was Jesus's regular institution. This was Paul's and the other apostles. They met on the Sabbath because it was the established day of gathering for the Jewish people. As time goes on, they're going to shift from Saturday to Sunday, but there is historical overlap between this time period. The Jewish communities would still have, Jewish Christian communities would still largely have gathered on Sabbath and worshiped then. The Gentile dominant communities seemed to start shifting to Sundays fairly regularly. But it was, in fact, a gradual shift even amongst the Gentiles. They did not just overnight decide, wait a second, the Lord was raised on Sunday, we need to worship on that day. No, it took time for them to work it out, to figure it out. And we're still doing it to this day because we're trying to express faith in the Lord in a specific way. So, Sundays become the day of worship, but that's not necessarily the same thing as the Sabbath. Just because we worship on Sundays does not make Sundays the Sabbath. That's not a thing in the New Testament. Thousands of New Testament verses. You don't have one verse that says, oh, by the way, we changed God's commandment. The Sabbath is no longer this, the Sabbath is now that. It's on Sunday and it's a day of worship. Nope, that's not the way it works. You can't change God's commandments. It just doesn't work that way. But they don't even claim that it is. They're just trying to make an association. This is the day the Lord rose from the dead. Can we afford to get together and worship on this day? And I'm betting across the Mediterranean world, some places did, some places didn't. And it took centuries for this to work itself out. Carla, I see you have a Bible open. Can you read 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4 into the microphone, please, so that it's on the recording? 1 Corinthians 16, just the first 4 verses, please, whenever you get there.
Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredited by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me.
Okay, so my question here, because this is a verse that often gets quoted for worship happening on Sunday in the Christian communities. But my question is, does the text actually say that they were meeting in worship on the first day of every week? On the first day of every week, put some money aside because I'm coming and I'm going to collect it and I'm going to take it to the church in Jerusalem. Right. Should we assume that he's telling them to set money aside because that's the day of worship? Maybe. Okay. My point is we need to think a little bit more about this. First off, Paul doesn't actually say they were meeting to worship on Sundays. But is it because he doesn't have to? Have they already shifted in Corinth to worshiping on Sabbath to include the Gentiles now? and now they're worshiping on Sundays. Is that it, or is it just a practical thing to say, hey, at the beginning of every week, just take up a quick collection, and whenever I get there, I'll take whatever you've collected up to that point? All I'm saying is you want to slow down and you want to examine your preconceived conclusions, because this verse is going to get taken as proof in proof texting that they were worshiping on Sunday, and it may actually be implying that. But all I'm saying is that it doesn't say that, so you have to be careful about what you're implying that the Bible never says. One of the things that people are constantly assuming the Bible says is that the Sabbath is somehow Sunday. And it's not. That's not a thing in the Bible. And let's just take this. This is a Catholic, like the Baptist Faith and Message catechism question and answer thing. I don't even know from which English version this comes from, but I just want to read it. Which is the Sabbath day? Answer: Saturday is the Sabbath day. Why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday? We observe Sunday instead of Saturday because the Catholic Church in the Council of Laodicea in 336 AD transferred the solemnity from Saturday to Sunday. Why did the Catholic Church substitute Sunday for Saturday? The Church substituted Sunday for Saturday because Christ rose from the dead on Sunday and the Holy Ghost descended on the apostles on Sunday. Question: by what authority did the Church substitute Sunday for Saturday? Answer: the Church substituted Sunday for Saturday by the plenitude of the divine power which Jesus Christ bestowed upon her. So basically says we decided ourselves to do it. We decided ourselves to do it 300 years after Jesus, officially. So my point in all of this is to say, most of the stuff that we've historically assumed, and most of the times that you're going to hear people talk about the Sabbath in modern American churches, they're going to assume that it's on Sunday. Don't even know where this came from in church history, not in the Bible. And because we assume it, and it very often our biblical ideas come from much later in history, we don't go back and rethink it. Because of that, we come to wrong conclusions. And that's why I teach my lessons, to help you think and hopefully rethink. By just pointing out the way that the ancients, the people actually writing the text, would have thought about it. What questions are and are not going through their heads. The idea that Sunday is the Sabbath is not a biblical idea. It is a church history idea that, I'm sorry, but I thought we were Protestants. I thought we protested Catholic doctrine. What does this mean when it comes to the Sabbath? And so you can say, hey, we want to worship on Sunday because the Lord rose on that day, and it's the day the apostles, or the Holy Ghost descended on the apostles. Great. I have no problem with that. Don't call it the Sabbath. The Sabbath, yes, you use the wrong nomenclature. It's like, does that, because they're equating here the assumption that the Sabbath was a day of worship. But the Sabbath wasn't a day of worship until after the exile. David, Solomon, under the kingdom, would not have equated the Sabbath with, oh, I have to go to the tabernacle and worship today. Oops, got to get up to the temple. Got to go worship today. It's the Sabbath. You could, you didn't have to. Most of the time that the Sabbath falls as a day of worship was during a week-long worship festival, right? And that's why it can be. The priests have to rotate working on that day in case anybody can only make it there on the Sabbath because they're not working their fields and their animals and their shepherds and stuff. So it's open to worship. It is not a mandatory thing. People's misunderstanding of the history is what actually causes all of this miscommunication generation after generation after generation. When in fact, all God wanted was this simple act of faith that said, you know what, God, I'm not really in control. I guess I'll just take a break. I guess I'll just relax. And that will be my expression of faith that you are in control. I have tried for the last 6 days to deal and tackle with this problem. Hasn't worked out for me. The universe is not going to implode if I take 24 hours off. So, the next 24 hours, it's your business, it's not mine. And it's not giving up on the problem, because if it comes back on Monday or Sunday and the problem's still there, you're going to get to work with it again on tackling the issue. But you have to say, I'm ultimately not the one in control. And resting is the opportunity to say this. And I don't think what the church is doing in the New Testament in the first century that we can see is that they're not at all officially saying we're doing away with the Sabbath or we're changing the Sabbath to Sunday or anything. They're just saying we want to express our new faith differently because God's done something new here. He's done something different. Here's how we're going to do it. And God is actually very much okay with that. All I'm saying is it's important to think deeply. It's important to think clearly about all biblical issues. Don't accept every little thing you've been told without question, because without asking questions, or dare I say raising objections to accepted ideas, neither you nor the community you're in is ever going to grow. The Sabbath, adapting to becoming an official day of worship, and then that day of worship changing to Sunday, is an example of humans working out details of how they are going to relate to Yahweh as their God and King, and Him being okay with them making their own decisions and their choices. This is going to overlap with what we're going to get into in chapter 2 of Genesis over the summer. Adam named the animals, and whatever he named them, that was their name. God does not interfere with human decisions like that. But does any of this actually imply that the fundamental idea of the Sabbath being a day of rest on Saturday, not Sunday, has changed? To which I would answer, no. I see no reason and no evidence for that in the text whatsoever. I see only church history passing down things generation to generation that they themselves haven't questioned and asked about, and they haven't gone back and done much of any exegesis on the issue and understanding of it in the historical context of which it grew up. And okay, but my point is you might actually be violating the fourth commandment if you don't just give up control for 24 hours at the end of every week. Just remember the fact that you're not in control, God is, and let it go. Don't deal with your issues for one day. In 6 other days, you're going to be able to deal with them and fight, and you're going to fight that chaos and that disorder that God was doing, and you're going to have to wrestle with it all. But for 24 hours, you're going to have to remember you're not really the one in control. So don't wrestle, don't fight, don't go to work. Don't yell at your boss or have your boss yell at you and stuff, And you're going to have to decide for yourself how you're going to work that out. This is an important rule for our culture to learn because you could work 7 days a week and think that life's all about the material. Life's about making that money. Life's about making all this. Like, if you think you're really in control of your life and that's the purpose you want your life to go, you do that. Personally, I don't think I'm that important. I don't think I'm in that control. And I like having my weekends and just doing relaxing things.